Everyone, thank you for joining today's webinar about encryption, key management, and PKI. We're excited for the discussion today, and I will now pass it over to our speaker, Cynthia, to get us started.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining this webinar. My name is Cynthia Peralta. I am here as the Senior Director of Cybersecurity for the Encryption, Key Management, and PKI teams. I'm here to discuss in our webinar episode number 2, our key lifecycle management. That was the topic that was selected from the previous attendees. So thank you to those that were able to attend, and hopefully we can jump right in and answer any questions you guys might have at the very end. Thank you, Kate, for the quick intro. All right, here's some agenda items. We're going to talk about a few things in addition to these items, but we're going to do a quick recap of some of the previous webinar topics that we talked about during the episode 1. For those of you that were able to attend, you guys are probably already familiar with a lot of this, these topics. However, I wanted to kind of quickly do just a quick recap. We're going to talk about what key lifecycle management is, and we're going to get into the details of how to manage those keys and the associated certificates appropriately. So how many of those challenges do we really have? Do we really understand what it means to encrypt these keys and how they're all used? Do we know who has access to them and if they're being rotated regularly? These are all questions that are going to come up, especially if you're going to be audited. And some of the more experienced folks are also going to ask these types of questions to see how you manage your environment and even the medical device ecosystem for security purposes. So do you even have audit logs that show who is utilizing the keys that are associated to protecting their information? So if you can't prevent the keys from being compromised, then what's the point of really encrypting anything in the first place, right? So we're going to dig into that a little bit more. Cryptographic keys are a vital part of any security system. They do everything from data encryption and decryption of any users or even authentication. The compromise of any of these cryptographic keys could lead to collapse of an organization's entire security infrastructure. So as you can imagine, allowing the attacker to decrypt the sensitive data or even authenticating themselves as privileged users can cause a lot of problems. They can also give themselves access to other sources such as classified information. But we really need to understand that luckily proper management of these keys and their related components can ensure the safety of confidential information. We're going to dig a little bit more into what that confidential information really is and what it means to protect it. So key management is the process of putting certain standards in place to ensure the security of cryptographic keys in an organization. Key management deals with the creation, the exchange, the storage, the deletion, and even the refreshing of those keys. They also deal with the members that have access to those keys. Okay, so we're going to dig into that. Let's see what's coming up next. So we're going to talk about the different types of keys. These are the 2 types of keys that most are familiar with. I'm going to talk a little bit more. This is kind of what we talked about in the first episode, but we're going to talk about a little bit more again this time around, just to kind of do a quick refresh and dive into a little bit more of the details of what it means to have a symmetric versus asymmetric cryptographic key. There are 2 types of cryptographic keys as mentioned here. Symmetric keys deal with data at rest, which is data stored in a static location, such as a database, etc. Symmetric key encryption uses the same key for both encryption and decryption. Using that data in a database as an example, while the data is stored in the database, it is encrypted with a symmetric key. Once an authorized user, however, attempts to access the data, the information is decrypted with the same symmetric key and made accessible to the user. The other type of cryptographic key is an asymmetric key. Encryption using asymmetric keys can be a little bit more complicated than symmetric key encryption. Instead of using the same key for both encryption and decryption, you now have 2 separate keys called a public and a private key, and they're each used for the encryption and the decryption of the data. These keys are created as a pair so that they relate to each other. The public key of a pair of asymmetric key is mainly used to encrypt the data. This key can be shared with anyone since it encrypts, not decrypts, the data. The private key is used for the decryption of data encrypted by its public key counterpart, so it must stay secure. I know I just said a lot, and it's probably confusing some of you that are not familiar with this process, but Just know that asymmetric keys are two separate keys that have different functionalities but are related to each other. Asymmetric keys focus on encrypting data in motion, and data in motion is data that is sent across a network connection, whether it be a public or private connection. When transporting sensitive data, most encryption processes use both symmetric and asymmetric keys to encrypt data. The data is first encrypted at rest by asymmetric encryption key, to be clear. The symmetric key is now encrypted by the public key of the person who the data is being sent to. That encrypted symmetric key and the ciphertext are sent to the recipient of the data. So once the ciphertext and the key reach the recipient, the symmetric key is decrypted by that user's private key, and the ciphertext is decrypted. Confusing, I know. All right, we're going to talk a little bit more about the various phases of the key lifecycle management. The task of key management is the complete set of operations that are necessary in order to create, maintain, protect, and even control the use of the cryptographic keys within your medical devices and their interconnecting systems and environments. Cryptographic keys have a life cycle, believe it or not. So do their associated digital certificates, which we'll get into later. They're created, they live useful lives, and then eventually are retired. The typical medical device encryption key lifecycle likely includes the following phases. We have key generation, registration of that key, the storage of that key, the distribution and even the installation of that key, all the way down to the use, the rotation, and even the backup and the recovery, which is very important. We'll talk about that later. And the revocation, believe it or not, and the suspension and the destruction of those keys at the end of life of the key. Defining and enforcing the key management policies affects every stage of the key management lifecycle within the medical devices and those interconnecting environments and systems, as mentioned earlier. Each encryption key or group of keys needs to be governed by an individual key usage policy defining which medical device or group of devices or even types of applications can request it and what operations that device or application can actually perform. So for example, encrypt, decrypt, or sign. In addition, encryption key management policy may control supplemental requirements for elevated levels of authorization in the key management operation to deliver a key after it has been requested, or even to recover the key in case of loss. Let's hope that doesn't happen. And to add a little bit more onto the various phases, the most vital characteristic to consider is what the key is utilized for as it relates to medical devices. The medical device manufacturer should always be vigilant not to use any one key for various and different purposes. An important distinction should also be made between data keys, which is used to encrypt data, and key encryption keys, which is used to encrypt keys, and they're exclusively used to safeguard these keys. Keys are fundamentally used for encryption of data on the medical device ecosystem, but encryption often functions as a very duplicitous proxy for other implementations such as authentication and signing. You can actually prove who you are based on ownership of a key. Once a key is generated, the key management system should manage the chronology of conditions that a key progresses through over its life cycle and enable an authorized administrator to operate them when required. The National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, provides guidelines for most aspects of the life cycle of cryptographic keys and has also defined some standards on how a crypto period is determined for each key. A crypto period is the operational life of a key, and it is determined by a number of factors. Some of those factors include the sensitivity of the data or the keys to be protected. From this information, and how much data actually also is important. How much data and how many keys are being protected is also an important factor here. But from this information that's extracted, the operational life of the key can actually be determined along with the key length, which is typically proportional to the cryptographic strength of the system, and the algorithm. It's determined by the purpose of the key. So for example, if you have an algorithm that is applicable to a signing purpose only, Whereas RSA, for example, is appropriate for both signing and encryption. So NIST specifies those cryptographic algorithms in more detail that have ultimately withstood the test of time. More details can be provided in the NIST website. If you guys would like that reference, please let me know. All right, next we're going to talk about impact of changes in a cryptographic key state. Excuse me a second. So we're going to talk about key compromise, vendor support management, advancements in technology, and how these items can actually impact those key states. The occasional need to change a key state based on unexpected circumstances are inevitable. It just happens from time to time, and you need to be aware of what those are. When it's necessary for an authorized administrator to make changes to the key's parameters, which cause a change in the key state during a key lifecycle, whether the key is or whether the key or associated data or even the encrypted key is suspected of compromise, a change in the vendor support of product, or you need to replace the product, technological advances that make it possible to attack where it was previously infeasible, change of ownership, where a change of key is associated with a change of assignment of liability, and even regulatory requirements, contractual requirements, or even policies that mandate a maximum operational life, such as the crypto period that we mentioned earlier. Those are various reasons for the impacts of changes in cryptographic key states that we should all be aware of, and I'm sure there are a lot more that we need to consider, but these are just some top items that come to mind. Next, we're going to talk about the generation phase. The generation of a key is the first step in ensuring that the key is secure. If the key in question is generated with a weak encryption algorithm, then any attacker could easily discover the value of the encryption key. Also, if the key is generated in an insecure location, the key could be compromised as soon as it is created, resulting in a key that cannot be safely used for encryption. So key generators, AES encryption algorithms, or even random number generators tend to be used for secure key generation. Keys can be generated through a key management system, a hardware security module, a trusted third party, which essentially they should use a cryptographically secure true random number generator, known as TRNG, for seeds, and ideally should be generated on the device itself as well. The key storage database, which demands a master key for encryption, will then store the keys along with their attributes. Attributes include items like the name of the key, the activation date of that key, the size of the key, and even the instance. A key can be activated upon its creation or said to be activated automatically or even manually later. Each key should have a key strength that's generally measured in number of bits that are associated with it that can provide adequate protection for the entire useful lifetime of the protected data, along with the ability to withstand attacks during this lifetime. The different key lengths will depend on the algorithm that uses them. A standard cryptographic algorithm that has been thoroughly evaluated and tested is highly, highly recommended. All right, next we're going to talk about distribution. Distribution and loading are the next step of the key lifecycle, which is ensuring that the safe distribution of these keys are not compromised, essentially. So keys should be distributed to the required user via a secure method, whether it's through TLS or SSL connection, to maintain the security of the keys being distributed. If an insecure connection is used to distribute the cryptographic keys, then the security of any data encrypted by these keys is in question, as an attacker could execute a man-in-the-middle attack and steal the keys. The objective of the deployment, and loading phases is to install the new key into a secure cryptographic device, either manually or even electronically. This is the most critical phase for key security and should only be performed by authorized personnel in the case of manual installation, for example. How to distribute cryptographic keys are a classical problem, like issues such as eavesdropping, spoofing, or man-in-the-middle attacks, or how to control accesses in a secure but flexible manner. Symmetric cryptographic schemes suffer from key distribution problems. In general, the IMD, implantable medical device as an example, and other authorized devices such as the programmer need to share a key or a set of keys that is used to generate authentication tokens or gaining access to the IMD device and to encrypt communications. The suitability of a particular key distribution scheme depends on the type of device, the expected interactions with other parties, and other assumptions about the operational environment. So, for example, if the programmer and the medical device will have a lasting relationship, a preset key can be used. The solution could be valid when the programmer is always a device belonging to the patient or the physician. In these cases, a first approach consists of preloading a factor key on the authorized device. This factor might be renegotiated between the legitimate parties during the first communication session to update the key. It is crucial to protect these keys and guarantee that only authorized entities, whether it's the patient and the healthcare staff, have access to them. Such keys will be used to build various cryptographic tokens, for example, an authenticated token or an encrypted message, used in the transaction between legitimate entities in the system. Cryptographic keys used by the device can be stored in an external wearable device, such as a smart bracelet, although externalizing the key storage incurs a significant risk because the loss of such a device, so for example, if the patient loses the bracelet or it gets damaged, would render the device inaccessible or will facilitate access to unauthorized users. Excuse me. Some authors propose to print the key into the patient's skin using ultraviolet pigmentation, but that can be read by medical professionals in case of emergency. However, the keys might be read by an attacker who has physical access to the patient, and its presence may be detected due to its proximity. Things to consider. After distribution of the key, it is used for cryptographic operations. As we previously talked about, the key should only be used by authorized users to make certain that the key is not misused, that it's not copied, etc. When the key is used to encrypt data, it must then be stored for later decryption. The most secure method is via hardware security module or something similar, typically a FIPS validated device 140-2, level 2 or higher. All right, next we're going to talk about backup and storage. Very important. This doesn't get talked about enough, I feel. So in order to retrieve a key that has been lost during its use, so for example, due to equipment failure or forgotten passwords by administrators or healthcare professionals, etc., a secure backup copy should be made available. Backup keys can be stored in protected form on external media or by using an existing traditional backup solution, such as a local or even a networked connection. When a symmetric key or an asymmetric private key is being backed up, it must be encrypted before being stored. In healthcare, for example, information is both abundant and immensely important. Year after year, as the volume of healthcare data increases, the need to protect the medical records more effectively and efficiently against loss or corruption becomes increasingly critical. With so many opportunities for malicious or accidental loss of data, so for example, if an employee makes a mistake or if a ransomware attack successfully encrypts and locks down data stored in the network, or even a natural disaster causes server damage, etc., it is not a question of whether a healthcare organization will experience data loss at all, but rather how will they recover and move forward when it inevitably does happen. The term backup and recovery refers to the process of creating and safely storing copies of data that can be used as backups if the original data is lost or corrupted, thereby protecting organizations against the many ramifications of data loss. This is also referring to the cryptographic keys that are used to protect the sensitive data itself. So if the cryptographic keys that were used to obfuscate and protect sensitive data is lost or compromised and cannot be recovered, the likelihood of being able to restore the backed up health data is also at risk. This is why having proper controls around who is authorized to perform those backups, the recovery, and the frequency of which it is performed, the storage and access of those sensitive pieces, as well as the testing results of performing regular backup needs to be tested. What good is it to back up data if it doesn't work, right? So we need to make sure that it works. Recovery using backups generally involves restoring the data to the original location or to another secondary location where it can be used in place of the damaged or lost data. Backup and recovery solutions work by creating point-in-time copies of data, files, servers, and storing these copies in a secondary storage platform that is isolated from your local devices so that they can be recovered if needed. Depending on your region, you may be required to back up your data in order to comply with different data protection regulations. Regulations place certain demands on organizations, for example, laying out requirements for data protection, privacy, and even retention. Some will have requirements regarding the level of encryption, while others will stipulate what data should or should not be retained. Any backup and recovery solution you employ will be subject to compliance regulations every bit as much as your production, so it is vital that you ensure the solution you choose can provide the security and compliance support that your business requires. The HIPAA security rule, for example, mandates in requirement 45 CFR here listed that all recovered entities, including health plans, healthcare clearinghouses, and healthcare providers, implement a compliant data backup plan. The data backup plan should establish and implement procedures to create and maintain retrievable, duplicate copies of electronic protected health information, etc. Along with that, also needs to be considered is the cryptographic keys associated in protecting and securing that data, whether it's at rest or even in motion, depending on the overall solution you use. This requirement is a section of the Code of Federal Regulations, which contains the administrative safeguards for the HIPAA security rule. And it covers things like the security management processes, the security awareness training, and even the contingency planning in the context of preventative measures against the theft, loss, or unauthorized disclosure of any EPHI, electronic patient health information, for anybody that's not aware. Disasters are unavoidable and can strike at any time, often at the least opportune moments. These disasters could be natural disasters like floods, fires, and earthquakes, power outages, human error, and even cyber attacks, or even, as we found in 2020, an unexpected and entirely unprecedented global health crisis like a pandemic. The retention policy feature is offered by most backup and recovery solutions and help to ensure that backups are retained as long as they are needed and that old backups which are no longer needed are expired to save storage costs and prevent exceeding storage limits. Backup and retention length is straightforward for organizations in regulated industries like healthcare, as there are regulatory requirements that stipulate the length of times backups should be retained. Retention periods and storage limits should be tailored to your organization's needs and should support adherence to any necessary compliance requirements. For details on that, I've included a link here for reference. All right, next we're going to talk about even archival. Archival refers to the offline long-term storage for keys that are no longer in operation. These keys usually have data associated with them that may actually be needed for future reference, such as long-term storage of emails, etc., even some critical information about the patient's health that was previously needed and accessible. There may also be associated data in other external systems. So when we're archiving a key, it must be encrypted to add security. As recommended in the creation and deployment phases, it may be useful to encrypt a symmetric key with the public key of an asymmetric key pair so that the person or entity holding the corresponding private key can only decrypt it. Sometimes, depending on the key's deployment scenario, archival is the last phase in the life process and never moves on to deletion or destruction. An archived key cannot be used for cryptographic requests. In certain cases, the key can continue to be used to, for example, decrypt data previously encrypted with it, like old backups, but even that can be restricted. An administrator can, if necessary, reactivate an archived key. Before a key is archived, it should be proven that no data is still being secured with the old key. Two other ways of dealing with a compromised key are revoking or destroying the key in question. is revoking a key means that the key can no longer be used to encrypt or decrypt data, even if its crypto period is still valid. We can destroy a key. Destroying a key, whether that is due to compromise or due to it no longer being used, deletes the key permanently from any key manager database or other storage method. This makes it impossible to recreate the key unless a backup image is used. NIST standards require that deactivated keys be kept in archive to allow for reconstruction of the keys if data encrypted in the past must now be decrypted by the key or key pair. Next, we're going to talk about end of life as it relates to the cryptographic key lifecycle management. The last phase is the end of the key's lifecycle, where all of its instances, or just certain instances anyways, are completely removed and recovered, or recovery of that key actually may be possible depending on the method that's being used actually. The end of life for a key should only occur after an adequately long archival phase and after adequate analysis is done to ensure that the loss of the key will not correspond to loss of data or other keys. Once a key's crypto period or time period the key is usable passes, the key must be rotated. When the key of an encrypted set of data expires, the key is retired and replaced with a new key. First, the data is decrypted by the old key or the key pair, and then encrypted by the new key or key pair. Rotation is necessary because the longer a key is in rotation, the more chance there is for someone to steal or find out the key. Rotation of keys can happen before the crypto period expires in cases where the key is suspected to be compromised. There are 3 methods of removing a key from operation. Key destruction, which is the method that removes an instance of a key in one of the permissible key forms at a specific location. Information may still exist at the location from which the key may be feasibly reconstructed for subsequent use. Next, we have key deletion. This method removes an instance of a key and also any information from which the key may be reconstructed from its operational storage or use location. Instances of this key may continue to exist at other locations, so for example, for archival purposes. And then key termination. All instances and information of the key are completely removed from all locations, making it impossible to regenerate or reconstruct the key other than through a restore from a backup image. All right. Another important piece, in addition to backup and recovery, is monitoring. The importance of monitoring keys during their life cycle cannot be stated even more immensely than now. The key management system should be able to handle all of the transitions between phases of a life cycle and should be capable of monitoring and keeping track of those workflows. There are certain aspects of monitoring that should be considered. Some of them include unauthorized administrative access to the system to ensure that any unapproved key management operations are not performed. The computer processor may also be under significant load, so when combined with an overloaded cryptographic service, the results could be serious, including data corruption or even unavailability. Monitoring the key's life cycle is also important to ensure that the key has been created and deployed properly. In episode 1, we also talked about the importance of not only who has access to the keys, but who has the ability to make changes to the environment with those associated keys as well. So really monitoring and alerting on the utilization of these keys and the audit logs, as mentioned in the previous episode, are incredibly important that they are maintained and secured as well. Only those that have authorized access should be able to modify and or not be able to modify at all any of the logs associated with those auditing and compliance requirements. So making sure that those logs are secured and locked down appropriately with principle of least privilege in place is absolutely important. We're almost done here, but I wanted to quickly run through some of the best practices that I think are important here. So the following items that I listed here are important practices to follow just to ensure the compliance with government regulations and even standards and also best practices. We want to avoid hard coding keys. The most important practice, and I mentioned this in the last episode as well, the most important practice with cryptographic keys is never hard coding key values anywhere. Hard coding a key into open source code, for example, or even code of any kind instantly compromises and can compromise the key. Anyone with access to that code now has access to the key value of one of your encryption keys, resulting in an insecure key. So keep an eye out for that. Least privilege. The principle of least privilege is the idea that users should only have access to keys that are absolutely necessary for their work. This assures only authorized users can access important cryptographic keys while providing better tracking of key usage. If a key happens to be misused or even compromised, only a handful of people have access to the key, so the suspect pool is narrowed down if the breach was within the organization. Hardware security modules. They're a physical device which stores cryptographic keys and performs cryptographic operations, typically on-prem. For an attacker to steal the keys from an HSM, they would need to physically remove the device from the premises, typically, not always, but a lot of times they can. They need to steal a quorum of access cards or storage keys or access keys, because there's a lot of split knowledge and shared responsibilities around this in order to access the HSM and bypass the encryption algorithm used to keep the key secure. FIPS guidelines through NIST offers a wide list of items that they look for, especially as they do the evaluation. So HSMs on the cloud are also a viable key management storage method, but there's always the chance that, for example, even the cloud service provider's security may fail. So allowing an attacker to access the keys stored within is a possibility as well. So we need to make sure that hardware security modules that are FIPS validated and or certified are being utilized and understanding what level of assurance they are providing as well. Automation is widely practiced method of ensuring keys do not go past their crypto period and become overused. Other portions of the key life cycle can be automated as well, like creating new keys, backing up keys regularly, distributing those keys, revoking those keys, and even destroying those cryptographic keys. We also want to create and enforce policies. Creating and enforcing security policies relating to encryption keys is another way many organizations ensure the safety and even the compliance of their key management systems. Security policies provide the methods everyone within an organization follows and creates another method of tracking who can and has access to certain cryptographic keys, essentially. Separation of duties and responsibilities. Separation of duties related to key management is another important practice for any organization. An example of separation of duties is that one person is assigned to authorize new users access to keys, while another distributes the keys and a third person creates the keys. With this method, the first person cannot steal the key during the distribution phase, or the key during or learn the value, of the key during the generation phase of the key lifecycle. And that also leads me into split keys or even split knowledge. One final practice to ensure the strength of any key management system is by splitting the keys into multiple portions. In this way, no one person knows the full key, rather multiple people must come together to use the key. This assures that others can be held responsible by their peers if their portion of the key is compromised. Again, this goes back to the importance of monitoring and alerting and detecting of these types of actions to be taken. So as you can see, anything that has to do with the life cycle and the management of these keys is essential to an overall robust and secure environment. And this includes not just the medical devices and the methods in which we are leveraging the security, and whether it's a TPM or some sort of MCU that has encryption capabilities, cryptographic accelerators or processors, et cetera. but it also includes your network, your environment, the methods in which they are connecting, whether it's to a hospital network, et cetera, having a firm grasp and understanding of what's going on within that hospital network, even the methodologies around who has access, how are they accessing the networks, and overall the environments. There's a lot of talks about how do we do such a thing when we don't control the network, for example, in the hospital where these medical devices may be deployed. We answer this question a lot, and we get this question a lot, and we answer it a lot of times with the possibilities that could encompass some possible solutions. We're happy to talk to you guys if you guys have any questions about how this works. We're happy to solve problems that I know are out there and exist. We just need to hear it from you what those issues are. We here at MedCrypt, we specialize and we work very closely with those that have previously also worked with the FDA and understand what it's like to go through the submission process and a lot of the issues and pain points that these medical device manufacturers are facing. So we welcome you to reach out at any point with any questions you may have. You can reach out to myself. You can reach out through our newsletters as well that guys should also be receiving. And you can also feel free to reach out to me directly here. My email is cynthia@medcrypt.com. Anything that you guys would like to discuss in the next episode as well, I also welcome. I would love to hear your feedback about this current web episode, I guess we could call it, webinar episode. And if you guys, like I said, have any additional questions, topics you would like to have covered in the next webinar episode, feel free to reach out and let me know. And I'll hand it over to Kate for Q&A. Thank you so much for your time.
Cynthia. We can now open the floor for a Q&A. So you can use the Q&A chat feature on your screen to type in any questions that you have. You can also raise your hand and we can unmute you if you would like to ask your question verbally. The Q&A chat function works really well. And then I also just opened 2 polls we'd really appreciate you responding to. One is for topics that you'd be interested in learning more about in the next episode, and then what the most useful topics were from today's episode. So please fill those out before you leave, and the chat box is open for any questions. Okay, looks like we got a question. Cynthia, can you see that in the Q&A?
Let me check. Oh, here we go. Okay, so the question is, how do you balance the usefulness and cost of HSMs, both in acquiring and maintenance or in cloud-based HSM services? Okay, making sure my microphone's not muted still. So that's a great question, and I'm glad you're asking that. We understand that HSMs are expensive, but here's something that we also like to pose as part of getting you to also think about if we were to have a key compromise and or a medical device intellectual property, for example, for reverse engineering and being utilized in whether it's gray market or other methods to reverse engineer the device and sell it in the gray market or black market, however we want to call that. The damage of doing that, in addition to the possibilities of getting denied by the FDA, therefore you have to sit within the FDA, let's just say their desk files of that they have to go through, many of them. And the time that you're waiting to get a response or get an approval for that said submission, for example, how much money is actually being spent in that process of holding up your pilot line, for example, your manufacturing line, telling them to halt all manufacturing because we have not received the approval we need to proceed with the manufacturing, and or even like I was saying earlier and alluding to, is the compromise of such keys that are associated, whether it's for your devices and or even your ecosystem within your network, et cetera. If they were to be compromised, what damage would that have to not only your reputation, but also to the patient health and even recalls that may happen if it's not done securely and correctly, right? So that's why I'm really emphasizing that although HSMs are expensive, and I do understand that, there are cloud based versions of those HSMs, as you mentioned here, that can help alleviate the costs with managing such devices in a hardware fashion, in an on prem fashion. But the reality is, weighing the pros and the cons for doing it not only in a more secure fashion the first time around, but not having to redo it all over again. And it costing your company a lot more money because we not only have discovered that a key was compromised, therefore intellectual property has now been leaked. And not to mention also, we now have to recall some of these devices that we had deployed into other environments and patients, and not to mention even those IMDs that I mentioned earlier, which are really important to consider. So that's the importance to me in making sure that we understand that although there is an upfront cost, long term there is a cost savings if it's done correctly the first time around, rather than having to go back to the drawing board and doing it all over again had it been done correctly the first time. And I'm saying this from experience in working with very, very large medical device manufacturers that faced similar issues, and which why we were contacted and why we were contracted as well, is because they said, oh, we have it figured out, we're good to go, we don't need any PKI related or encryption key management consulting services. And then come to find out, a couple months or years later, they come back and say, we need your help, and we realized we messed up. We put a lot of band-aids in place, can you help us out? So uh, that's what I mean by, although it's an upfront cost, and I do understand that, and the concerns of who's going to manage it and how, and now I need to hire more people and all of that. There are cloud-based solutions that do help with a lot of these concerns that may be posed. So Max, I hope that answers your question. Another question by William. Thank you, William, for your question. How are critical medical devices that potentially use weak key encryption managed? Well, that's the interesting thing is there are weak encryption methodologies out there that are being leveraged, unfortunately. But most of the time, that'll get flagged by regulatory bodies. For example, the FDA. The FDA will say, no, 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 please go back to the drawing board. We do not allow this. However, I have seen situations where I wouldn't say things like DES or any other type of like super outdated cryptographic algorithms being leveraged, or even key sizes lower than 128. But the concerns are real and they are there, and the reasons why the concerns are there are multifaceted and they need to be considered. But a lot of times, those items are flagged right away, and a lot of these medical device manufacturers become aware or are already aware that they need to make this change, and their legacy devices and even their firmware versions, for example, don't support this newer, stronger crypto processing. So they need to make some adjustments and changes there, from whether it's their microchip, MCU controllers, etc. Hopefully that answers your question. You're welcome, William. These are great questions, by the way. I see some friendly names in here. Hi, Axel. Hi, Felix. Shout out. Nick, see you. Sarah, see you. Any questions you guys want to pose for the audience to kind of hear? I'm putting you guys on the spot. You, Axel. This question posed by Axel says, what are common crypto implementation errors you have seen? Wow. Common ones that I've seen have been these, gosh, where do I start? Without exposing, of course, the who, but implementations where I've seen a laptop being utilized, for example, for serving as a crypto processor and even storage for these sensitive keys. And I call them sensitive keys because symmetric keys and the private key within an asymmetric crypto implementation are considered sensitive keys. But I also consider sensitive data. I have seen where these laptops were leveraged for the storage of these sensitive items, sensitive data. And unfortunately, they were not stored securely in a secure room. They should be secured in a safe that only those that have a, again, going back to split knowledge and even shared duties and responsibilities, that have access to a safe, for example, and no one else should have access to that safe other than their backup counterpart. So folks that have access to the room, for example, do not have access to the safe, and so on and so forth. So those types of controls needed to be ironed out. Those are the common implementation issues that I've seen because there's a loss in understanding of the physical parameters versus the logical. Logically speaking, a lot of times those that are in the security industry understand that logically speaking, how they need to secure a lot of times the sensitive information, whether it's the sensitive keys and or sensitive data. But where they lose line of sight is typically in the physical aspects of securing such things. And that also is why I drill down heavily on this particular episode around backup and recovery. Backups of these laptops were not being done. So, and not to mention, these laptops were not intended for storage of sensitive data and information. A lot of times, what we consider a secure method or implementation it typically needs to be a device that is, like I said earlier, is FIPS validated, right? And there's various levels of FIPS validation and or certification. Certification is really hard to achieve, so I always use the terminology validation, but we can use it interchangeably here. But that's the most common issue that I've seen is more just forgetting about the physical aspects of securing the sensitive information, who has access to what, and the backups of that sensitivity of data. Other things that I've seen, just because we have a little bit of extra time, I'm going to cover. Other things that I've seen is the concerns around, hey, we don't know what's going on within the hospital environment. We can't control what's happening in the hospital networks. So we really don't know. We're just assuming that everything is secure and everything's fine. And that's great. I'm glad that things feel like they are secure, but the reality of it is there's some due diligence that needs to happen to better understand what needs to be done within a network environment so that your medical device is also secured. I see another question. Thank you, Felix. 1 second. So there's a lot of great avenues in which we address these concerns, but we really need to be familiar with what does it mean to have a secure ecosystem. Ecosystem is anything and everything that touches, whether it's the device or even our network environment. So we need to better understand that, have a firm grasp and understanding of how we can protect it and what kinds of things we can do to ensure that we know how those things are functioning and working and secured, whether it's at rest or in motion of data. Axel, I hope that answers your question, but those are the most common implementation issues that I've seen. Um, okay, so Felix is asking, what has been the main hurdles? You're welcome, Axel. What has been the main hurdles for medical device manufacturers or clients in adopting PKI in their products? Great question. Similar, I guess, to what Axel was asking as well. A lot of the hurdles that I've seen is that upfront cost, like Max and I were, kind of alluding to essentially in the first question, where Max asked, the usefulness and the cost of leveraging HSMs, for example. When it comes to PKI environments, there have been a lot of concerns around who is going to also manage this because we don't have the resources to manage. We don't have a security engineer or operational engineer, et cetera, or an architect to help us in designing this and maintaining it and securing it and doing the day-to-day, so to speak, of functionalities, because the reality of it is it does require at least someone to have oversight, because you do have a lot of automation in place to alleviate a lot of those issues and concerns, but there does need to be a relying party that also has administrative privileges to ensure that you're not just relying entirely on, for example, a cloud provider. Cloud providers do a lot of the work for us in these securing of PKI environments. However, we cannot 100% rely on that. And of course, there's also a lot of delineation and identification. I'm going to bring it up here really quickly and briefly because, again, contact your attorneys and get confirmation of these things, but there are also contractual obligations that they have and where they draw the line from a relying perspective of these are what we are contractually agreeing to being liable for, and these are the things that you should consider. They don't always call that out, but typically those are things that we need to consider. So like I said, for legal advice, reach out to your attorneys to find out how that works and what kinds of things you would be liable over someone or some cloud providers. But the reality is those are the main hurdles I've seen is the upfront cost of managing such environments and the resource constraints around how to do it and the knowledge and expertise needed to really do it correctly. Hopefully that answers your question, Felix. Great questions. We have 3 minutes left, it looks like. You're welcome, Felix. So, Kate, how are we doing on the polls? Did we get a lot of good feedback?
Let's see, I haven't closed them yet, but I'll close them now so everyone get your last votes in. And let's see. Yeah, we have a good amount of information on here. You can see the results.
Excellent. All right, if there's nothing else, I guess we can end early. Kate, thank you so much for leading this. You always do such a wonderful job. I appreciate your help with this. And thank you everybody for attending. Such a pleasure to have all you guys here. Some of you that are return attendees and those of you that are new. Feel free to spread the word, share the video with anybody else once it gets uploaded. Kate will reach out to you all attendees. And feel free to reach out, like I said, Cynthia@medcrypt.com if you have any questions. Hopefully talk to you guys soon.
Thank you, Cynthia, for a great presentation. And everyone who is on the call today will receive an email with the recording. So you'll be able to watch it back as needed. And if you would like to reach out, you can email Cynthia, or you could also reply to the email that you get with the recording, and we can set something up with you. So thank you all.
Thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful day.